He rejected her once. She stayed. He rejected her twice. She waited. The third time, she sent him one single text, yes or no, and he read it 17 times and deleted it without answering. He told himself it was the right call. He told himself he was protecting her. Rafael Moro had walked into rooms where everyone wanted him dead and walked out with what he came for. But the one thing he never figured out how to face was the cost of the choices he made in silence. Then Soul happened. A missing interpreter, a stranger waiting in a hotel lobby, and the moment she said a name, 4 words, completely ordinary, he understood, in a way he could not undo, exactly what 3 deliberate no's had built. This is not a story about a man who loses. This is a story about a man who finally sees clearly. And what he does with that clarity will tell you everything about what real strength actually looks like. This channel is about mafia bosses' men, born to dominate, to lead, to see the world at a level most people never reach. But the lessons they carry are not taught in any school. This channel does not tell crime stories. This channel tells you about mindset, about backbone, about the secrets behind real power. If that is the world you want to understand, you are in the right place. Here's what this story is really about. It is about the price of avoidance. Every time Raphael said no, he called it wisdom. Every time he kept the distance, he called it protection. But protection and fear can wear the same coat, and the only way to tell them apart is to ask yourself, honestly, am I staying away because it is right, or because I am not ready to be accountable for what comes after yes? The most powerful man in the room is not always the one who controls the most. Sometimes he is the one brave enough to finally pick up the phone and tell the truth to the person who deserves to hear it. If this story hits something real for you, leave a comment below and tell me. Have you ever protected someone by staying away and found out later what that cost you? Like this video if you stayed until the end. Share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. And subscribe, because next week we go deeper. The best lessons are still ahead.
Rafael Moro had walked into rooms where everyone wanted him dead and walked out with what he came for. He had done it in New York, in Palermo, in Marseille, and once, memorably, in a strip club in Phoenix at 2 in the morning that he never talked about to anyone, not even to Luca. He had never done it somewhere he couldn't understand a single word being spoken around him. That, he was about to discover, was an entirely different category of problem. The private jet was somewhere over the Pacific. 3 in the morning. All the cabin lights were off except the small reading lamp above his seat at the rear of the aircraft. Raphael sat alone with a stack of documents on the folding table, a glass of water he hadn't touched, and the particular silence of a man who had been doing this long enough that 40 zeros and feet over ocean felt like the most normal place in the world to be at this hour. He read the way people read when they actually mean it. No phone beside him, no music, no television in the background. Just the documents and his eyes moving across them at the pace of someone who had reviewed this material before, and was now locking it into the part of his brain where things stayed. The Soul deal was straightforward on paper. Chairman Edward Sterling, 58 years old, founder and chairman of Sterling Pacific Group, one of the largest transportation conglomerates in South Korea. A $40 million logistics contract. 7 days to negotiate the terms, finalize the structure, and get 2 signatures on paper. Raphael had done larger deals in worse conditions. The variable was always the room. You could prepare for everything except the room. He finished the last page, set the documents face down on the table, and called toward the front of the cabin. Raphael said, "Get Marco." Danny appeared from behind the partition. 30 years old, 5 years in Raphael's employ. Good enough at his job that Raphael had stopped consciously noticing how good he was, which was the highest compliment available in that world. Danny cleared his throat. It was a very specific kind of throat clearing. The kind a person does when they are about to say something they would much prefer someone else was saying. Raphael looked up from the documents. He did not say anything. He just looked at Danny, and Danny understood that the look was the question. Danny said, "Marco called, sir, about 4 hours before departure. Family emergency. He said he couldn't make the trip." Raphael said nothing. Danny continued, "Henry has already arranged a replacement. A freelance interpreter based in Seoul. 8 years of experience. Corporate clients, embassy work, clean references. She'll be waiting at the Shilla Hotel at 6 in the morning." Still nothing from Raphael. Danny said, "Her name is Vera Cole." Raphael heard that name, and something inside him went very still. Not visibly. Not in any way Danny would notice or anyone else in the world would notice. Just the particular stillness of a man whose internal machinery has registered something significant and is deciding, very quickly, what to do about it. He nodded once. Raphael said, "All right." Then he turned and looked out the window. Below him was dark ocean, no lights, no landmark, nothing to read or understand or control, just black water for thousands of miles in every direction. He had Vera Cole's number in his phone for 2 years. He had deleted it 8 months ago, 3 days after not answering a text message he had read 17 times. He had told himself, in the specific private language that men use when they are not being entirely honest with themselves, that not answering was the right call, that it was cleaner, that it was better for her, actually, if you thought about it from a certain angle. He had thought about it from that angle many times. Usually around this hour, he picked up the documents and went back to reading. He did not absorb a single word for the next 6 minutes, which he would not have admitted to anyone, and which Danny, to his credit, pretended not to notice. The first time Raphael had met Vera Cole was 2 years ago in New York. She had been hired to interpret for a high-end auction event, 7 days of corporate dinners and private viewings, and the kind of careful conversation that happened when very expensive things changed hands between people who did not particularly want to know each other's full names. By day 5, there was something in the room between them that was not professional anymore. Anyone with a reasonable amount of experience reading rooms would have seen it. Vera had more than a reasonable amount of experience reading rooms. So did Raphael. On day 6, she said it out loud, directly, not dramatically. She was not a person who made dramatic statements about things that were simply true. She said, "I think you know what I want to ask, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd rather hear you say it than keep pretending neither of us is thinking it." Raphael said, "This isn't something I do. No explanation, no apology, no softening." She had nodded. The way you nod when you receive information you were mostly expecting and have already begun to process. She said, "All right." And she had left. The second time was 15 months ago. A gallery opening in Washington. Nobody planned it. They had ended up in the same corner of the same room at the same time, which in a city of 700,000 people should have been impossible but apparently was not. They talked for 3 hours. He left before the evening ended. No explanation that time either. The third time was 8 months ago. A text message, short, no decoration, no pressure. Just, "I'm going to ask one more time, yes or no." He had picked up his phone. He had read those words. He had sat with them for a long time, long enough that he thought about what yes would actually mean, what it would require of him, what he would have to stop pretending in order to mean it. Then he deleted the message, and he had called that a decision. He had called it, to himself, the responsible one. Now, 8 months later, he was sitting in a jet over the Pacific Ocean, and in approximately 3 hours he was going to walk into a hotel lobby in Seoul, and she was going to be standing there. He put the documents down. He looked at the dark water outside. He thought about his father, which was something he did sometimes at 3 in the morning when the air pressure changed. Antonino Moro had come to Newark from Sicily with nothing except his hands, his trade, and a complete inability to speak English. He had worked as a tailor for 20 years in a city where not speaking the language meant you navigated by instinct and patience, and the kindness of people who were willing to wait while you pointed at things. He had died in a hospital room at 50 years old, because no one understood what he was saying. Raphael had been 12. He had sat in a hallway outside the emergency room because they told him he was too young to go in. Inside, his father had kept asking for water and describing where the pain was moving. The attending physician thought he was confused and administered a sedative. Antonino died at 5 in the morning from a complication that could have been identified and treated if anyone had understood what he was illnessing them. Raphael had carried that fact for 33 years like a stone in his chest, not constantly, but always there, always the same weight. He had built his entire professional life around one rule that grew directly from that night. Never put yourself in a situation where you don't control the language. Never be the person in the room who cannot understand what is being said around him. It was a good rule. It had served him well for 2 decades. Seoul was about to be the first exception. The Shilla Hotel in Seoul, 6:20 in the morning. The lobby was the kind of space designed to make you feel immediately that wherever you had come from was smaller and louder and less composed than this. Marble floors, pale gold light, flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. Vera Cole was standing when Raphael walked in. Not sitting, standing. One hand on the strap of her work bag, one hand around a coffee she had bought from a cart outside the hotel. Not the hotel coffee, which told him something right away about how she operated. She wore a gray blazer and dark trousers, hair pulled back cleanly, a simple watch on her left wrist. She was watching the entrance the way you watch an entrance when you've been in enough new cities that watching entrances has become a habit rather than a conscious choice. She looked up when he came through the door. 2 seconds. That was all. 2 seconds of two people looking at each other in a hotel lobby at 6:20 in the morning, neither of them where they expected to be, both of them processing a significant amount of information simultaneously. Not the 2 seconds of an employee recognizing a new employer. The 2 seconds of two people who had something unfinished between them and were mutually silently, without discussion, agreeing not to discuss it here. Not in this lobby. Not in front of Danny and the other men who had come in with Raphael. Raphael said, Vera Cole. Not a question, he already knew. Vera said, Mr. Morrow. Also not a question. Then she went directly to the work. She said, I've read the briefing. I have questions about the protocol for the Sterling meeting. The agenda has some structural issues I'd like to walk through before we go in. Raphael said, You'll have 30 minutes in the car. Vera said, I'll need 45. A pause. Raphael said, Fine. He walked toward the elevators. In the elevator, going up, he said something to Danny in Italian. A quick note about the afternoon schedule with Henry, a reminder about a call he needed to make. It was habit. He switched to Italian when he wanted to make sure something was understood precisely. Vera stood beside them in the elevator and looked straight ahead at the closed doors. No expression. No movement. He didn't notice. Danny nodded and made a note. And Vera, standing 18 inches away, heard every word of what Raphael said in Italian. She understood every word of what Raphael said in Italian. She had understood Italian since she was 8 years old. She said nothing. The elevator reached the 22nd floor. The doors opened. In his room, Raphael set his luggage on the rack and looked at it, not for long. Just a beat longer than necessary. The carry-on, dark brown leather, combination lock. He looked at it the way you look at something when your instincts are raising a question your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. Then he moved on. That evening, standing at the window of his room while Seoul lit up 30 floors below, Raphael held his phone and scrolled to the letter L in his contacts. His thumb stopped on Luca's name. He stood there for a moment. Then he put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay down on the bed in his clothes, and looked at the ceiling while the city below him kept going, the way cities do, without pausing for anything happening inside the buildings above them. He did not sleep for a long time. The car moved through Seoul at 8 in the morning in the particular traffic of a city that has decided to be fully awake before most of the world has finished breakfast. Vera had the briefing documents out before Raphael had finished settling into his seat. Paper, not a tablet. He noticed that. She said, When you say flexible timeline in your opening remarks, do you mean you'll negotiate the schedule if they push back? Or do you mean you'll walk away if they don't move? Raphael said, I'll negotiate. Vera said, then don't use the word flexible. In Korean business register, flexible coming from a foreign party in a first meeting implies you don't have a firm position. They'll negotiate harder. Use open to discussion instead. Different weight entirely. Raphael looked at her. She was already on the next point. She said, don't use the word urgent either. In Korean, urgent implies desperation. Timely is better. And I'd move the financial presentation to the fourth agenda item, not the third. Raphael said, why? Chairman Sterling's was educated in Japan in the 1980s. Japanese business culture establishes relationship before numbers. If you table the financials too early, he doesn't know you yet, and people negotiate hardest with people they don't know. Give him 20 minutes to take your measure first. He'll be more receptive when the numbers arrive, even if he won't acknowledge that's why. Raphael was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Seoul went past in the gray morning light, apartments and office towers and construction cranes and the green hills that sat behind all of it like something the city had simply grown around. Then he said, you're not asking if I'm ready, Vera said. I'm asking so I can make sure they hear what you actually mean. Those aren't always the same thing. He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. She was looking at her notes. She said it the way she said everything that was simply true, without emphasis, without waiting for a reaction. He had worked with interpreters in 23 countries over 20 years. Every one of them had asked him what he wanted to say. This was the first one who was asking what she needed to know in order to say it correctly. It was a small difference. It changed the entire shape of what she was to him in that car. He said, patriarch mode. I want him to decide this by trust first and numbers second. Vera made a note in her small notebook. Dark leather cover, worn at the corners, dense with handwriting in a mixed shorthand she had developed herself over years of professional listening. She said, good. That's what I needed. Sterling Pacific Group occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. The 40th floor conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city in a way clearly designed to remind any visitor exactly where the power sat in this relationship. Chairman Edward Sterling was already in his chair when they entered. 58 years old, silver hair, conservative suit, the specific kind of physical stillness that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in every room you walk into. His nephew Tommy sat 2 steps behind his right shoulder, 28 years old, American educated, with the careful expression of someone who has learned to be useful without drawing attention to himself. 3 assistants were arranged at the far end of the table. The handshakes were formal and brief. The meeting began. What happened in that conference room happened on 3 levels at once. On the surface, 2 companies were discussing a $40 million logistics contract. Raphael spoke in English, Vera translated into Korean. Sterling responded in Korean, Vera translated back. Clean, professional, the way these things looked from the outside. Below that surface, something else was running. Sterling was testing Raphael. Not aggressively, subtly, the way experienced negotiators do, watching to see how Raphael held territory when Sterling implied he wasn't sure Raphael had the authority to close. Watching to see whether Raphael would show impatience or anxiety, or the specific kind of eagerness that meant the deal mattered to him more than to Sterling. And below that, a third layer. Sterling said something quietly to Tommy in Korean. Not in the main flow of the meeting. A brief aside, barely loud enough to be part of the official conversation. Vera heard every word. She leaned toward Raphael and said, barely above a whisper, he just told Tommy that you look younger than he expected, and he's not sure you have the authority to close this deal. Raphael did not change his expression. Not a single muscle shifted. His next statement appeared to be entirely about shipping timeline. It was about shipping timeline. It also contained, as if incidentally, a reference to a deal he had closed 12 years ago in a similar structure at a contract value 8 times the size of the one currently on the table. Not boasting, just information. Information that arrived with exactly the weight it carried. Vera translated it with that exact weight, not more, not less. The way a surgeon makes a precise cut, exactly where it needs to be, nothing extra. Sterling listened. Something small shifted in the set of his shoulders. Not agreement, recognition. After the meeting, riding down in the elevator, Raphael said, "You changed something when I was speaking." Vera said, "You changed something first." I adjusted the translation to match the intent, not just the words. Raphael said, "And if I don't want you making those adjustments," Vera said, "then you need a machine, not a person." Machines translate words. I translate meaning. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. At lunch in a restaurant on the building's upper level, Raphael watched Vera the way he watched things he didn't fully understand yet. She was completely at home in Seoul, in a way that he simply was not. She ordered in Korean without looking at the menu, made a brief natural exchange with the server that ended with both of them smiling. Read something on her phone with the comfortable ease of someone reading in their first language, not their second. And once, when her phone buzzed on the table, she glanced at the screen and made a very small, warm smile before turning it face down. He noticed that smile. He said nothing about it. He ate his food and thought about his father, who had navigated 20 years of American life without the language to move through it easily, and who had done it with a quiet dignity Raphael had not understood as a child and had thought about every year since. This restaurant, in this city, in this lunch, this was what his father had felt every day in Newark. The texture of existing in a place where you cannot follow the background conversation, where the signs outside mean nothing, where the sound of people talking around you is just sound, not information. His father had carried that for 20 years and never complained about it. Raphael had built his entire life around never feeling it. One week in Seoul was going to show him something about that. That evening, Henry came to Raphael's room. Henry was 45, had been Raphael's soul-based partner for 12 years, and was the kind of person whose instincts Raphael trusted without needing to understand the reasoning behind them. Henry said, "Sterling Pacific has asked for your shipping manifests. Last 3 imports from Genoa and Marseille. They're calling it due diligence." Raphael said, "That's not due diligence, that's targeted." Henry said, "I know. I'm trying to find out what he's looking for." Raphael said, "He's looking for something specific. Something he thinks I might be carrying." Henry didn't answer, which was itself an answer. After Henry left, Raphael opened his suitcase. Not to get anything. He took everything out and laid it on the bed methodically. Then he ran both hands along the interior lining, slowly, starting at the top and working down. Lower right corner. Slightly firm under the fabric, not dramatically, just enough to feel if you were looking for it. He pressed along the edge of the lining with his thumbnail. Found the seam. Pressed more carefully. A cream-colored envelope, letter-sized, sealed with strong adhesive. He held it for a moment. Then he put it back where he found it, pressed the lining back into place, repacked his clothes, and closed the suitcase. Not yet. He needed to know what was in it before he decided what to do about it. And to know what was in it, he needed someone who could read it. He picked up his phone. He did not call Danny. He did not call Henry. He called Vera. Before any of that, before the document and the decisions it forced, there was the morning of the second and a word that changed the temperature of everything. Vera walked into the preparation room at 7:30 a.m. and said, "Sit down. I want to teach you one word." Raphael sat. He didn't ask why. This was, without him registering it consciously, the first sign that something in the dynamic between them had shifted. He was starting to treat her judgment in her domain the way he treated Henry's judgment in logistics, as information worth receiving without requiring a full explanation first. Vera said, "Guanchanayo." She said it clearly and with the particular patience of someone who has taught words to people who will almost certainly mispronounce them. Raphael repeated it, badly. The syllables landed in the wrong places. She said it again. He said it again. She corrected the third syllable. He adjusted. Better. She corrected the tone. He adjusted again. She did not encourage. She did not sigh. She just corrected the way a good mechanic tightens a bolt, exactly as much as needed, no more. What does it mean? Raphael said. Vera said, it's usually translated as I'm fine or it's okay. But that translation is too flat. In Korean, this word does something different. It means we're okay here. Not just you, not just me, both of us together, in this moment. You use it when you want someone to feel less alone in a moment that's uncomfortable. There's no perfect English equivalent, Raphael said. Why this word specifically? Vera said, because Sterling is going to test your nunchi today, your ability to read the room. If something goes sideways and there's an awkward pause, if you can say this word naturally, not like you looked it up last night, it tells him you can feel the room. That's worth more than any contract term. Raphael looked at the notebook she was writing in. Then he looked at his hands on the table. He said, not in the business register, not in the tone he used for professional information. My father died in a hospital in Newark. He was 50. No one understood what he was saying. He kept asking for water, and they thought he was talking about pain. The room was very quiet. Vera did not say she was sorry. She didn't say anything for several seconds. She just nodded once. The nod of someone receiving something important and understanding that what it requires is not a response but a witness. Then she said, that's why this word. She didn't explain further. She had found the connection between the word and the wound without being shown where to look. That meant she had been paying attention at a level he had not realized. She reached for her notebook and wrote something. The dark leather cover, the dense handwriting in the mixed notation system she'd built over 8 years of professional listening. Raphael said, what is that? Vera said, notes. Things I need to remember about how a person speaks, about me, among others. What does mein Zebum say? She looked at him for a moment, then she said, that you pause before the most important thing you're going to say, and that you look at your left hand when you're deciding whether to trust someone. Raphael looked down. His left hand was flat on the table. He had no memory of putting it there. The second meeting with Sterling went better than the first. Midway through the session, there was a silence. Not hostile, just the specific quiet that falls in a negotiation when both sides have said everything prepared and are waiting to see who adjusts first. Raphael said the word. Guainchanayo. The pronunciation was still not clean, but the inflection was right. The word landed with its correct weight, which Vera had spent 40 minutes that morning making sure he understood. Sterling looked at him. Not the evaluating look from the first meeting. Something slightly warmer. A photograph coming a degree more into focus. Tommy translated quietly for his uncle. Sterling responded with something brief. Tommy said, he says it's a difficult word for foreigners. Most can't hear the difference in tone. Raphael said, most foreigners don't know why the tone matters. Vera translated this. Sterling heard it. And something in the room moved in a direction that would have taken 2 more days of meetings to achieve through conventional means. After the meeting, walking out through the lobby, Vera said, you modified the word's meaning slightly. You used the we constructions instead of the I construction. Raphael said, that was an accident. Vera said, it worked better than the correct version would have. He looked at her, is that a compliment? She said, it's an observation. He almost smiled. Almost. That evening they ate dinner at a small restaurant Vera had chosen in the old quarter of the city. Narrow street, wooden sign outside, the kind of place that doesn't appear in any hotel concierge recommendation because it doesn't need to. Raphael looked at what arrived in front of him. What is this? He said. Vera said, rice cakes and spicy sauce. Extremely common. Very good if you can handle heat. He ate it. He didn't make a performance of it. He finished it. They talked about the next day's meeting and then they didn't. And the conversation drifted in the way conversations drift when two people are comfortable enough to stop managing the direction. Vera explained Nunchi more fully, the concept that went beyond reading a room, that was about feeling the atmosphere beneath what was being said, the emotional weather of a conversation. Raphael said, Sterling was testing it today. The pauses. Vera said, yes, and you passed because you didn't fill them. He said, what would have happened if I had filled them? She said. He would have thought you were nervous. People who fill silences are usually afraid of what the silence says about them. He looked at her. Are you afraid of silences? She said. Almost never. He said. Neither am I. She said, I know. There was a pause then, which neither of them filled, and which both of them noticed. Near the end of the meal, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. That small, warm smile appeared. Brief, private, involuntary. She said, sorry, and turned it face down. He did not ask. She did not explain. But he watched her hand set the phone down carefully. The way you set something down when you care it out, and he felt onto something he did not yet have a name for. Walking back to the hotel, 3 blocks through Seoul at night, neon signs, street food carts. The cold air that carried the smell of both, Raphael said quietly. Guanchanayo. Still not perfect, but better. Vera didn't turn around. She nodded once and kept walking. That was the second of 3 moments between them that could not be called professional and could not be called anything else either. Back at the hotel, Henry was waiting with another piece of information. He said, Sterling's office called again. They want the manifests within 24 hours. They said, if there's a delay, the timeline needs to be reconsidered. Raphael said, he's not asking about the manifests because of the contract. Henry said, no. A pause. Henry said, Raphael, there's something I need to tell you about the night before you left. He explained about Marco, the call, the request to add something to Raphael's bag, Henry's refusal, the failure to follow up. Raphael listened to all of it without interrupting. When Henry finished, Raphael said, why are you telling me now? Henry said, because Sterling is asking about your luggage history. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Raphael nodded. Find out who might have reached out to Marco. Quietly. Henry left. Raphael stood in the empty room and thought about the lower right corner of the suitcase, about what was inside the envelope he had found and pressed back into place. Tonight, he would look at it properly. Tonight, he needed to know what he was actually carrying. 11 p.m. The city outside was still blazing. Raphael had not slept. Under normal circumstances, he did not sleep easily in unfamiliar cities. Under these circumstances, sleep was a theoretical concept. He opened the suitcase. He took everything out. Shirts, trousers, documents, the hard-sided toiletry case, every item placed on the bed in order. Then he turned the suitcase and ran both hands along the interior lining. Slowly, methodically. Lower right corner. He pressed carefully along the seam, pulled the lining back. The cream-colored envelope was there, sealed with strong adhesive. He opened it carefully, 9 pages, printed on thin, high-quality paper, Japanese characters, dates in international format, 1998. He stood in the hotel room for a long time. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and thought precisely about what he was holding. Someone had placed this in his luggage. The only person with the access and the time was Marco. Marco, who had been packing for this trip for 2 weeks. Marco, who had called Henry the night before departure, asking to add something to Raphael's bag, before calling to cancel the trip entirely. What Raphael was holding was something someone had wanted him to bring to Seoul, either to use it himself, or to be found carrying it, or to deliver it to someone without knowing he was doing it. None of those options were good. He picked up his phone. He did not call Danny. He did not call Henry. He called Vera. Her phone rang 3 times. Her voice came on not sleepy. She had not been asleep. She said yes. Raphael said, I need you to come to my room. Something has come up. She knocked 12 minutes later. She was in a wool sweater and dark trousers. Not pajamas, not work clothes. The specific midnight clothing of someone who goes to bed, prepared to be needed. She looked at the documents on the desk without asking what they were. She said, Japanese? Raphael said, can you read it? She said, yes. She sat at the desk. She read. She did not speak for 2 full minutes. Raphael stood at the window and looked at Seoul and did not ask her to hurry, which was its own kind of statement. When she set the pages down, she looked up and said, this is a transaction record between an entity called EDS Pacific and a Korean government official. 1998. It documents payment for the approval of an infrastructure contract. Each transfer is dated. Every intermediary account is listed. Every step of the arrangement is recorded. She paused. She said, EDS Pacific. Edward Daniel Sterling. Silence in the room. Rafael said, if it's authentic. Vera said, if it's authentic, it's enough to end Chairman Sterling's career. And depending on how prosecutors interpreted the statute of limitations, potentially his freedom as well. Raphael said, it was in my suitcase. Vera said, yes, he said, which means someone put it there and sent me to Seoul carrying it. She said, yes. He said, Marco. Not a question, Vera said, the man who normally packs your bag and who is now unreachable with a sudden emergency. Raphael set the pages down on this desk. He looked at them for a moment, then looked up. He said, I need to know what you're going to do with this information. Vera said, I need to know the same thing from you. He said, I'm going to find out who put it there and return it in a way that makes absolutely clear it was never mine. I'm not here to threaten Sterling. I came here to sign a contract. She looked at him the way she had looked at the documents, with the focused attention of someone processing before concluding. Then she said, I need you to tell me what you actually do for work, Raphael. First time, no Mr. Neither of them acknowledged it, but both of them noticed. He said, I move things, expensive things, across borders, not always by the most direct route. She said, are you the kind of person who would use this document to hurt someone? He said, no, she said. Are you the kind of person who would let someone else use it? He said, no. She watched him for several seconds, reading him the way she read a room, not just the surface, but the layer underneath. Then she nodded. Once, small and certain. She said, then tomorrow we go to the meeting, and you let me handle the language. She stood up. He said, there's another thing you should know. Sterling is asking about my shipping manifests. He's looking for this document, which means he knows something was sent with me, even if he doesn't know I've found it. Vera said, he'll be testing tomorrow, seeing if you respond in ways that suggest you know what you're carrying. He said, yes, she said. I'll need to monitor his side of the conversation very carefully, he said. That's what I'm asking. She picked up her bag, stopped at the door. She said, I'll be ready at 8:15. He said 8:15. She left. He stood alone in the room with the 9 pages on the desk and the city lighting itself up outside. He thought about calling Luca. His thumb found the contact. He looked at the name for a moment. He put the phone down. He locked the document in his work briefcase, separate from everything else. Then he lay down on the bed with his shoes on and looked at the ceiling until the light outside shifted from night to the particular gray of early Seoul morning. The morning of the most important meeting. The car was 45 minutes through Seoul traffic, and they used every minute. Raphael had moved the document. Not in his luggage, not in the room, with Henry. At a secondary location that Henry knew and Raphael trusted. If anyone searched the hotel room or the car today, they would find nothing. He told Vera this in the first 5 minutes of the drive. She said, good. Then she turned to face him and said, before we go in, I need us to be clear on one thing. If the situation changes in that room, if something happens that shifts what I should be doing, you need to tell me. We can't rely on normal signals alone, he said. And if you hear something that changes what I should be doing, she said, I have a professional neutrality standard. Interpreters are supposed to. He said, I'm not asking you to break it. I'm asking you to tell me the truth in real time if I'm walking into something I can't see. That's different from taking a side. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, one word. No conditions. He understood that she had decided and that she would hold to it. Sterling was already in the conference room when they arrived. He was always there first. He had been running this building for 30 years and had learned early that arriving before others gave you the room before the meeting even started. Tommy stood behind his right shoulder. The assistants flanked the far end of the table. The meeting began. On the surface, it was what it was supposed to be. A contract negotiation, both parties working through terms, Raphael speaking and Vera translating, Sterling responding and Vera translating back. Clean, professional, the kind of meeting that looks straightforward from a distance. Beneath the surface, Sterling was doing something else entirely. His questions came around to the same subjects from different angles. The origin of Raphael's last European shipment, the customs procedures for Italian imports, the timeline of his last 3 transatlantic runs. None of it was about the contract. All of it was about what Raphael might be carrying, and whether Raphael knew it. Vera tracked both conversations simultaneously. She translated the official exchange and monitored the layer beneath it. Sterling leaned toward Tommy and said something in Korean, quiet, not addressed to the room. Vera leaned close to Raphael and said, barely above a whisper, "He just asked Tommy whether you seem like someone who knows what he brought. Tommy doesn't know. But Sterling knows a document was sent with you. He's not certain you've found it." Raphael did not alter his posture by a single degree. He continued looking at the documents in front of him. His next statement was about penalty clauses, and it was about penalty clauses. And it also contained a reference to a similar clause structure he had negotiated in London 5 years ago. Specific, precise, completely appropriate to the conversation, and completely disconnected from anything Sterling was fishing for. Vera translated it exactly. Sterling listened. Something very slightly shifted. Then Sterling said something to Tommy again. This time Vera translated directly. He's asking Tommy whether the agency that arranged your travel and hotel is one he's dealt with before. He's trying to trace back how you were brought into this deal. Raphael looked at her for half a second. A question. She gave a tiny nod. He said, "Chairman Sterling, I'd like to take a moment away from the contract discussion. There's something I'd like to address more directly, if you're willing." Tommy translated. Sterling looked at Raphael, the long, assessing look of a man who has been in rooms like this for 40 years and knows when the real conversation is about to start. He nodded. Raphael spoke slowly, clearly, in the register of someone who knows that every word is going to be translated and is making sure every word is worth the trip. He said, "I found something in my luggage that I did not place there. I don't know who put it there. That item is no longer in my possession. I have no interest in using it or delivering it for anyone. I came to Seoul to negotiate a contract. That is still what I want to do. The only question is whether you believe me." Vera translated, word for word. She did not smooth it, she did not soften it, she did not add anything. This sentence required nothing added to it. Sterling listened through the end of the translation. He did not respond immediately. He sat with the words for several seconds, which is a different thing from simply pausing, and anyone with 40 years of business experience can tell the difference. Then he laughed, quietly, not with humor, with recognition, the small laugh of a man who has seen very many things and has just, unexpectedly, seen a rare one. He spoke in Korean. Vera said to Raphael, "He says he has been in business for 40 years, and he can count on one hand the and a number of Edmonds told him the truth without being forced to. He says he would like to continue the negotiation." Raphael said, "Tell him I appreciate that." Vera translated. Sterling nodded. The meeting continued, and something in the room was different than it had been 10 seconds ago, something real and earned rather than performed. In the car going back, Seoul moving past in the late afternoon light, Raphael said, "There was something you added. Near the end of my statement about the timeline, it wasn't in what I said." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 4 words in Korean. Roughly, "Let's speak plainly here." The conversation needed a door opened, and neither side was opening it. I opened it. Raphael said, "You changed what I said." Vera said, "I translated what you meant." He looked out the window. A long moment. He said, "Don't do it again without telling me first." She said, "Fair." Another's pause. He said, "Thank you." 2 words. The real version, not the social version. That evening, while Raphael was working through papers in his room, Vera's phone rang in the hallway where she was reviewing notes. He heard her voice change register. Not the work voice, warmer, quieter. The voice you use when you don't have to perform for who you're talking to. He looked at his left hand, flat on the table. He went back to reading. He stayed at the papers until midnight. Then he set them down and looked at the ceiling for a long time before he slept. The bar on the hotel's upper floor looked out over Seoul at night in a way that made the city look composed entirely of light. Raphael had come up after 2 hours of calls, conversations he could not put off. decisions that required his voice and not someone else's. He was sitting alone with a glass of Barolo, his father's wine, the one Antonino had bought twice a year when something worth marking had happened in the Newark apartment. A good month, a small success, Raphael's school report when it was good, things that deserved to be acknowledged with something better than ordinary. Vera walked past the bar on her way back from the elevator and saw him through the glass. She could have kept going. There was no professional reason to stop. There was no obligation. She went in. She said, "I thought you'd be on the phone." Raphael said, "I was. For 2 hours. Now I'm not." She looked at the chair across from him. He gestured toward it. She sat. The server came. She ordered a glass of white wine. Local, whatever they recommended. They sat without a topic for a moment, and that was fine. Neither of them was the kind of person who needed to fill silence with words to prove they knew how to speak. Raphael started talking about Naples, not the tourist version. The version from his father's evening stories, the specific street near the harbor where Antonino had grown up, the bakery on the corner that had been operating since before the Second World War, at the quality of the light in late afternoon that his father described so precisely and so often that Raphael had grown up with detailed memories of a place he had never been to. He had gone eventually, alone, at 15, after his father died. He had walked those streets and had not found what he was looking for. Because what he was looking for was not a place, but the version of that place that had only ever existed in his father's way of telling it. Vera listened the way she listened in meetings, not waiting for her turn, not formulating a response, just receiving. Raphael looked out at the city and said something in Italian, not to her. Just said it. The way you say something when a thought only fully exists in the first language. He said, in Italian, "Sometimes I wonder if he would have known what to do here." He always knew how to be in a room where he was the outsider. I never learned how he did it. Vera answered him in Italian. She said, "Because he did it every day. We learn the most from the things we do every single day." Perfect Italian, Central Italian accent. The accent of someone who grew up inside a language, which is a completely different thing from someone who studied it. Fa set his wineglass down. He looked at her. He said, in English, "You speak Italian." Vera said, "Yes." He said, "Since when?" She said, "Since I was 8 years old." He said, "You've been in Italian conversations for 5 days, hearing everything said around you in Italian." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Vera looked at her wineglass. Then she looked back at him, not with the professional look, not with the assessment look, but with the look of someone who has decided to say the true thing. She said, "Because when people know I speak their language, they stop being careful. They say things they would never say if they thought I was a stranger to it." "In 5 days, what you've said in Italian in front of me." He said, "What things?" She said, "About the document, about Marco, about whether you trust Henry." A pause. She said, "About your father." Silence. Raphael said, "You heard all of that." Vera said, "Yes." "And you didn't say so." "No, that's a breach of professional." "I know. I'm telling you now." "Why now?" She held his eyes. She said, "Because today you told the truth in that room when lying would have been safer. And I realized I had been doing the opposite." The room held that for a moment. Raphael said, "What did I say about my father?" In Italian. The exact words. Vera said, "You said he always knew how to be in a room where he was the outsider. I never learned how he did it." He didn't speak. His left hand was on the table, flat. He didn't look at it. Vera said quietly, "He figured it out the same way you're figuring it out right now, by paying close attention to the person in the room who understands what everyone else is saying, and by trusting her." The lesson of the entire week, said not as a lesson, not as a moral, but as a quiet observation between two people who had spent 5 days reading each other carefully, and were now, for the first time, doing it without pretending not to. They talked for another hour. He asked about her stepfather, Carlo Esposito, from Naples, who had come to Seoul with the Italian Trade Commission and married her mother when Vera was 8 years old, who had relocated the family to Rome when she was 10, who had taught her Italian the way parents teach children's, not through grammar lessons, but through the daily accumulated texture of living in a language together. She told him Carlo had died in a car accident when she was 18, that her mother had gone back to Korea immediately, the pragmatic reorganization of a practical person confronting an irreversible fact. That Vera had stayed in Rome alone for 3 years because she didn't know how to be Korean anymore. The version of herself that was Korean's had been built alongside someone who was no longer there. He told her he understood that specifically, not in the general empathetic sense, in the precise sense. She asked, "What's your actual first language?" "The one you think in," he said, "Italian, but I've been living in English since I was 12, since your father died." "Yes. I switched without deciding to," she said. "Italian is where you keep the things you care about. English is where you do the work." "I knew that from the first morning," he said. "You knew that from the elevator," she said. "I knew it from how your voice changes. It's not dramatic, but it's real." The quiet between them was the kind that is not empty. Then Vera's phone lit up on the table between them. She glanced at it, turned it face down. Raphael said, "Someone's waiting," she said. He understands the time difference. He, that one word. Raphael heard it the way you hear something's of a room without moving any of the furniture. He said, he. Vera said, "We've been together about 4 months. He's used to the travel schedule," he said. "What's his name?" She looked at him. This was not a question from a client to a professional, but he asked it directly, and she was she reflected direct questions. She said, "Luca. Luca Ferraro." Raphael did not speak. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The city kept going outside the window. The bar kept playing its quiet music. The other guests kept existing in their own separate stories. Vera said more carefully, "Do you know him?" 6 seconds. Raphael said, "Luca Ferraro has been my closest friend since we were 6 years old." She looked at him. Neither of them said anything, for long enough that the music became audible, which it had not been before, and this was the moment. Not a table flipped, not a voice raised, not an accusation made. Just Rafael Moro, 45 years old, in a bar on the 40th floor of a hotel in Seoul, understanding, completely, finally, with no available exit, exactly what 3 deliberate choices over 20 months had built. He had said no. She had kept living. She had met the one person he trusted completely, the one person he had known longer than almost anyone else on earth. And neither of them had known. Nobody had known. There was no villain in this room. There was no one to be angry at. He had been so certain he was protecting her by keeping the distance. He had been so sure that not answering was the responsible choice. And here in a hotel bar, with a glass of his father's wine going warm on the table, he could see clearly for the first time what that protection had actually cost. Not her, him. It had cost him the ability to sit in this bar and feel uncomplicated. Vera stood up. She said, "Raphael," he said, "you don't need to say anything." She said, "I didn't know about you and Luca when I started seeing him. I didn't know about you when I took this job. The agency used your company name, not yours. If I had known." She stopped. He waited. She said, "I honestly don't know what I would have decided, but I need you to know I didn't know." He said, "I know you didn't know. There's nothing to explain." He said it without distance, without performance, just the fact. She picked up her bag. He said, "Vera." She stopped at the door. He said, "I turned you down 3 times, twice in person, once by not answering a text. That's mine. Whatever happened after is what was supposed to happen after I made those choices. That's how choices work." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I'll still be here tomorrow to do the work." He said, "I know." She left. He sat in the bar for a long time. The Barolo went fully warm. The music in the bar changed twice. The other guests filtered out. Eventually, it was just Raphael and the view of Seoul and his left hand flat on the table. He knew exactly why it was there. He was deciding whether to trust himself. Henry came to Raphael's room before breakfast the next morning, with the specific urgency that meant the night had not been quiet. He said, "Sterling has reached out through an unofficial channel, a contact who has worked between both our networks for years. Sterling wants a private meeting. No interpreter, just his nephew for English." He said it like a man reporting a weather system, factual, alert, not dramatic. Raphael said he wants Vera out of the room. Henry said he said. A pause. He said the interpreter knows too much. He didn't phrase it as a complaint. He said it as a warning. Raphael looked out the window. The city was overcast, gray clouds sitting low over the buildings. He said, Sterling knows she was in every meeting. He knows she translated things to Tomty, that he assumed she was following at a surface level. Henry said, she followed it at more than a surface level. I know that. He suspects it. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, Raphael, I've worked with you for 12 years. I need to ask you something directly. Does she matter to you outside of the professional context? Because if she does, you need to factor that in before you make decisions here. Raphael looked at Henry, the long, level look that in another context would be enough to end a conversation. Then he said, she does her job better than anyone I've worked with. That's all that's relevant. Henry held the look for a moment. He did not say he believed it completely, because he was an honest man, but he accepted it as the answers he was going to receive. He said, Sterling is smart enough and scared enough to be dangerous outside a formal business setting. Raphael said, I know. I want her moved to a different hotel tonight. Different name, different part of the city, and she stays in every meeting. Henry nodded. I'll arrange it. Raphael found Vera in the small workroom she had been using. She looked up from her notes when he came in. He sat without being invited. She had stopped commenting on this 2 days ago. He said, Sterling wants a private meeting. No interpreter. He's identified you as the variable he can't read. She said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm not meeting him without you. But you need to understand what that means. You're no longer professionally neutral in Sterling's view. He sees you as part of my side of this, she said. I stopped being professionally neutral when you called me to your room and showed me a Japanese document at midnight. He said, yes, she said. So this isn't new, he said. The stakes are higher now. I want you moved to a different hotel tonight. She started to say something. He said, Sterling has been protecting that secret for 27 years. Someone who protects something that long doesn't stop because it would be impolite. She looked at him, the assessment look, reading the information underneath the words. She said, you're worried about me. He said, I'm managing risk. She said, those aren't mutually exclusive. He held her eyes for a moment. He said, different hotel, and you stay in the meeting. She said, obviously. She picked up her bag, then stopped before the door. She said, Rayful, about the bar last night. He said, you don't need to. She said, I want to. She turned. I didn't know about you when I met Luca. And I didn't know about Luca when I took this job. If I had known either of those things, I genuinely don't know what I would have done. But I need that to be clear, he said. It's clear, she said. And I'm not going to pretend that what you told me last night doesn't change the context of everything we're doing here. He said, no, it does. She said, but I'm a professional, and this is still a job, and you still need me to do it correctly. So that's what I'm going to do. He said, I know. That's exactly why you're still the most important part of what I'm doing in this city. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and left. Tommy Sterling appeared at the door of Vera's new hotel room that evening. He had called the front desk with a delivery story. He was 28 years old and looked younger in the hallway light, tie loosened, jacket rumpled, the specific appearance of someone who has been carrying a decision around all day and hasn't set it down yet. He said, Mrs. Cole, can I have a few minutes? She stepped back and let him in. He stood just inside the doorway. He said, my uncle is not a bad man. I need to say that first, not as an excuse, as context. She said, go ahead. Tommy said, in 1998, Sterling Pacific was 8 weeks from bankruptcy, 800 employees. My uncle made a decision that kept them alive and kept those families housed and fed. The official he paid died in 2015. The case has never been opened. The only record that still exists is whatever is in that document. Vera said, why are you telling me this? He said, because I think Mr. Morrow is the wrong target. And because I watched him tell the truth in that conference room when lying was clearly easier. And I think if both sides keep treating each other as threats, someone is going to make a decision that makes everything worse. He said it, and then stood there with the stillness of someone who has said the thing they came to say and is now waiting to learn what it costs. Vera said. If you do this, if you act against your uncle's position, it creates real problems for you. Tommy said. I know, she said. Why are you here anyway? He said. Because I've been quiet about things I should have spoken about. And I'm 28 years old, and I want to try to do the right thing at least once in a situation that actually matters. He said it without theater. Just the plain truth of a young person who has found his limit. Vera looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I'll bring this to Mr. Morrow. What he does with it is his decision. Tommy nodded. He left. She told Raphael everything. Word for word, the way she translated everything, without decoration or commentary until she was done. Then she said, Tommy is right. Sterling didn't set this up. Someone outside used Sterling's fear and your logistics to engineer a confrontation between two parties who had no conflict before this week. The question is who benefits if this deal falls apart. Raphael said, a competitor. Someone who wants into the market we're covering. She said, someone who knew your travel schedule, knew Sterling's vulnerability, and knew how to reach Marco. He looked at his left hand on the table, then back at her. He said, Vera, when this trip is over, I'm going to call Luca. She was very still for a moment. She said, you don't have to do that. He said, he's my closest friend. He deserves to know from me before circumstances tell him. That's the only thing in this situation I can actually do right. She was quiet. Then she nodded. Once. Small. That was enough. Raphael called Marco on the private number the next morning. No staff. No intermediary. Marco picked up on the second attempt. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for this call for days and was simultaneously relieved and terrified that it had arrived. Marco said, Raphael, I'm sorry. Raphael said, tell me what happened. All of it. Marco told him. 3 months ago, someone had made contact through a mutual associate Marco had trusted for years. This person had obtained information about a financial arrangement Marco had made a decade. Nothing catastrophic in isolation, but enough to end his career in the industry if it surfaced. Marco had thought it was buried. It was not buried. The demand was simple. Before the Seoul trip, place an envelope in Raphael's luggage. Don't open it. Don't ask about the contents. The problem would go away. Marco said, I didn't know what was in it. I swear that to you. They said it was a private business document. They said you'd handle it on the other end, and it would never become an issue. Raphael said, what did the voice sound like? The person who contacted you. Marco said, Italian, but not native Italian. Learned, like someone who studies. Adult Vera moved closer to the phone. Raphael looked at her, sir. She leaned in. She said, Marco, I'm Mr. Morrow's interpreter. When this person spoke Italian, where did the stress fall in the words? At the beginning of the syllable or the end? A pause on the line. Marco said, the end. Definitely the end. Like they were pushing the weight forward. Vera said, thank you. She leaned back. Raphael said, Marco, I'll be in touch. He ended the call. Vera said, Germanic substrate. When speakers of Germanic languages learn Italian as a third or fourth language, they carry a specific stress pattern. They push toward the end of syllables. It's subtle but consistent. Dutch, German, Flemish, Belgian. One of those. Raphael said, someone who was watching my operation closely enough to know my exact travel schedule 3 months before I finalized it would be in the transportation sector. She said, a competitor, one who needed both you and Sterling weakened or separated. He said, Henry. Henry was in the room within 20 minutes. Raphael laid out what Marco had said. Vera gave her phonetic analysis. Henry listened carefully and then made 2 calls in Korean. Vera translated both calls in real time for Raphael in a low voice, not every word, the substance. The second call was the one that mattered. Henry hung up and said, I have a contact in the Brussels trade office. There's been movement in the past 6 months from a European logistics company trying to establish Korean market access. Blocked twice by existing partnerships. Raphael said name. Henry said Volker's Logistics, Antwerp. Family-owned 3rd generation. They have a Belgian-Flemish principal who speaks Italian as a 5th language. Vera said quietly, Flemish. That fits exactly with what Marco described. Raphael sat back, not angry, at the altitude above anger where very precise thinking becomes possible. He said, so Volker's found Sterling's old record, found Marco's old mistake, used both as levers. put them in motion against each other, and sat back. Henry said, "If this deal collapsed and you and Sterling went after each other publicly, Volkers walks into the vacant market with no competition." Raphael says, "It's boring," Vera said. "Big crimes usually are." He looked at her. She was right. The most damaging schemes were rarely dramatic in their mechanics, just people using available information with the least possible expenditure of effort. He said, "Set up a meeting. Sterling, me, you, Tommy." Small room. No agenda except exchanging what we know. The meeting happened the following morning in a conference room 4 floors below Sterling's main offices. Small table. 4 people. No assistants. Sterling spoke first. He said, and Tommy translated that 3 months ago he had received an anonymous message through a Hong Kong intermediary. The message said an American partner was arriving in Seoul carrying documentation related to a sensitive private matter. The strong implication was that this documentation would be used as leverage. He had not known who Raphael was. He had acted from fear. Raphael said, "I found the document in my luggage on the second night I was here. I didn't place it there. My interpreter was coerced into doing it by someone who had personal leverage over him. That person is a third party. Neither of us was his original target. We were his instruments." Vera translated all of it, precisely, completely, without adjustment in either direction. Tommy said something to Sterling in Korean. Vera translated to Raphael. "He's telling his uncle that the Hong Kong contact and the person who's coerced Marco are also almost certainly operating from the same source." Sterling listened. He nodded slowly. Then he spoke. Vera translated. He says, "Then we have a mutual problem, and mutual problems are best solved together." Sterling extended his hand across the table. Raphael shook it. Not a friendly gesture in the conventional sense. The handshake of 2 people who had spent a week misidentifying each other and were correcting the mistake. In Raphael's experience, that kind of handshake was worth more than most friendly ones. Walking through the lobby afterward, Vera said, "Tommy is going to have a complicated few weeks with his uncle." Raphael said, "He chose correctly." She said, "Sterling may not see it that way immediately." He said, "Sterling is smart enough to see it that way eventually, and Tommy will have to carry whatever his uncle thinks in the meantime." He paused. "That's what it costs to do the right thing in a complicated situation. It doesn't come free." She said, "You sound like you know that." He said, "Most things I say from experience." She almost smiled. Almost. The not quite version that he had come to recognize as its own specific thing. He almost smiled back. That was the third of 3 moments between them that could not be called professional and could not be called anything else. Raphael returned the document to Sterling directly. He brought it sealed in the original envelope, intact, with a handwritten note that Vera had translated into Korean in her own handwriting. "This was not mine to have. It was never mine to use." Sterling sat at his desk. Not the conference room, his private office, smaller and warmer, with photographs on one wall that the conference room didn't have, his family, his early businesses. A construction site from what looked like the late 1990s, hundreds of workers in the frame. He took the envelope, he held it. He did not open it. He knew what was inside. He said something. Vera translated. He says the most surprising thing in 40 years of business was never betrayal. It was finding someone who chose not to use what they had. Raphael said, "Tell him it isn't virtue, it's strategy. An enemy you made by accident is still an enemy." Vera translated. Sterling heard it. Then he nodded, the real nod, not the business version. He stood. He bowed slightly, the brief, genuine bow. Raphael returned it. Imperfect. True. Vera stood between them and said nothing, because nothing required saying. That afternoon, Raphael stood on the hotel balcony for a long time after 2 hours of calls. Then he called Luca. 3 rings. Luca's voice, warm, slightly surprised. "Raph, you're still in Seoul? I thought the deal was." Raphael said, "Luca, I need to tell you something," the way he said it. Luca knew immediately, 37 years of friendship, and he knew the specific register of Raphael's voice when what followed actually mattered. He said, "Go ahead." Raphael said, "Vera Cole, the interpreter I'm working with here. I've known her for 2 years. We met 3 times. I turned her down 3 times. The last time was 8 months ago when she sent a text and I didn't answer it. Silence on the line. Luca said, "You're telling me you know Vera." Raphael said, "Yes." Luca said, "And you turned her down." Raphael said 3 times. Another pause. Raphael had been through many difficult conversations in 45 years. This one was difficult for a specific reason, not because of what Luca might say, but because of what he himself had done, and how long it had taken him to say so. Luca said, "Raph, why are you calling me with this?" Raphael said, "Because you're my closest friend, and you deserve to know this from me, not from circumstances. Or not at all." Luca said, "Are you suggesting I?" Raphael said, "I'm not suggesting anything. She chose you. That is the truth. I'm telling you what I know so that when you move forward, if you do, you're doing it with the full picture, because you deserve the full picture." Long silence, the wait kind. Luca said, "You okay?" Raphael said, "I'm fine." Luca said, "Raph." Raphael said, "I'm fine, Luca, I mean it." Another pause. Luca said, "I need to think. Give me time." Raphael said, "Take what you need." He ended the call. He stood on the balcony with the phone in his hand, and Seoul going golden below him in the late afternoon, and he felt what he felt. Not simple, not easy, and also, in some specific complicated way, the feeling of a man who has finally done the thing he should have done, which is different from the feeling of a man who has made everything better. Sometimes those two things are the same. Often they are not. He had done the right thing. The outcome was not his to control. He went inside to find Vera. She was in the small workroom, packing documents into her bag. She looked up when he came in. She said, "You called him." Not a question. He said, "Yes." She said, "Is he all right?" He said, "He will be. He needs time." She set the bag down. She turned to face him. She said, "Raphael, I want to ask you something I don't have the right to ask." He said, "Ask it." She said, "The third time, when I texted,
Partially.
why didn't you answer?" He sat. He didn't answer immediately. "This was not a question you answered without meaning it." He said, "Because I was afraid." She waited. He said, "My father brought my mother into a life that wasn't built for her. She died young. I grew up believing that if you cared about someone and you were what I am, the responsible thing was to keep them at a distance. The third time you texted, I knew if I answered, I wasn't going to be able to keep doing that. So I didn't answer. And I told myself it was the protective choice." She looked at him. "That was your decision, not a judgment, a fact." He said, "Yes. And I've been living with what it built." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't know what I would have decided if I'd known about Luca when I started seeing him. Mleach, I genuinely don't, but I'm glad you called him. That's the only right thing available in this situation." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You're not the same person who landed here a week ago." He thought about that. "No," she said, "neither am I." He reached into his inside breast pocket and took out a small piece of paper. Old, the edges slightly yellow. He set it on the table between them. The handwriting was a teenager's handwriting. Careful and slightly uneven, the way you write when you are 15 and writing something important and want to do it right. A name, a date, written in Italian. He said, "My father's name. The day he died. I've carried this since I was 15. I've never shown it to anyone." Vera looked at the paper. She read the name in the right accent, the southern Italian accent, the way Antonino himself would have heard his own name. She said, "Antonino." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's a good name." He said, "He was a good man." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city was working its way toward evening. Vera opened her notebook to his page. She read what was already there. Then she wrote one final line, closed the notebook before he could see. He said, "What did you write?" She said, "Something I'm keeping." He looked at her. This was an answer he had no control over, and he realized, sitting there with his father's name on the table between them, that this did not trouble him the way it once would have. There were things that did not belong to him. Learning to actually live with that, not just tolerate it, but genuinely live with it, was its own kind of strength, a kind he hadn't known he was missing until this week. The contract was signed at 10 in the morning on the final day. Tommy handled the technical language. Standard terms, the kind that didn't require interpretation so much as confirmation. Vera sat in the corner of the room with a coffee, her work done, present because Raphael had asked her to stay. While he was signing, he glanced across the room toward her. 1 second. She was reading something on her phone and did not look up. After the signatures, after the handshakes, Sterling crossed the room to where Vera was sitting. He said something in Korean to her alone. After Sterling left, Raphael asked, "What did he say?" Vera said, "He said I'm better at this than just translating. He said I should know that." Raphael said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I know." He looked at her. "Do you actually know that?" She met his eyes. She said, "I'm starting to." Incheon International Airport. Early morning. That particular quiet airports have before the full-day crowd arrives. Raphael's flight to New York left at 10. Vera's flight to Rome left at 11:30. She had an assignment there, a corporate conference, 2 weeks of work she'd booked before any of this existed. They stood in the public departure area with their bags between them. The gate announcements ran overhead in 3 languages. Around them, 10,000 people were going 10,000 different places, and none of them knew or cared about the 2 people standing still in the middle of it. Raphael said, "Rome. How long?" Vera said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. He said, "And after that?" She said, "I don't plan that far ahead." A pause. The departure board shuffled and reset. He said, "I have a meeting in Milan, 2 months from now." Italian and English. She looked at him. "You don't need an interpreter for Italian and English." He said, "No," she said. "So you're not asking me as an interpreter?" He said, "No." She said, "What word would you use for what you're asking?" He said, "I don't have one yet. That's why I need someone who's good with words." She looked at him. The length of a moment that contains more than the time it takes. Then she smiled. The real one. Not the professional version and not the polite version. The one that was slightly surprised at itself. The one that appeared without permission. The one he had been watching for since the restaurant in the old quarter. She took the notebook from her bag, opened it to his page, read what was there, wrote one final line, tore the page carefully so out along the seam, folded it twice, held it toward him. He took it, unfolded it. The mixed shorthand, the private notation system she had been building for 8 years. Completely unreadable. He said, "What does this say?" She said the word slowly, "Sanjibiset." He said, "What is that?" She said, "A type of mushroom, very rare, only grows under very specific conditions. Most people who find it were looking for something else entirely." He looked at the paper, then at her. He said, "You wrote a mushroom." She said, "I wrote the metaphor." She picked up her bag, adjusted the strap, looked at him one more time with the look that was simply hers. Not the professional version, not the working version, just the real one. She said, "Milan in 2 months. Send me the dates." She walked toward her gate. He stood and watched her go, not reaching after her, not calling her back, just watching, the way you watch something you have finally stopped trying to hold on to and have started, instead, trying to deserve. Then he put the page in his inside breast pocket, next to the old paper with his father's name, and picked up his bag and walked toward his own gate. On the plane back to New York, Raphael sat in the same seat at the rear of the aircraft. Same small reading lamp, same folding table, same stack of work documents. He held the page she had written. The shorthand he couldn't read. He put it in his breast pocket next to Antonino's name. 2 pieces of paper. 2 languages he could not read. For the first time in a long time, that did not feel like a problem. He opened his work documents. He went back to business. Because that was what you did. You carried the things that mattered, and you kept moving. And the carrying was not a burden so much as a reminder of what was real. His father had known that without being taught it. It had taken Raphael longer, but he had gotten there. 2 days later, in a cafe in Rome, with afternoon light coming through the window and Italian all around her, Vera's phone rang. Luca's number. She picked up. She said, "Luca." His voice was steady, not cold, not broken. The voice of someone who had sat with a difficult truth for 2 days and had come through the other side still himself. He said, "Vera, I need to talk to you." Not on the phone. She said, "I know." He said, "When you're back." She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks is fine. A pause. "I'm not calling to end anything. I'm calling because I think we need to be honest with each other about some things, and I'd rather do it in person." She said, "That's fair." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." She set the phone down and looked out the window at the street below. The street she had walked 1,000 times since she was 10 years old. She opened the notebook to a new page. Wrote at the top, Milan, 2 months. Dates TBD. Below that, in plain handwriting, because some things don't need to be encoded, he finally asked for the word he didn't have. That's new. She closed the notebook. In a small cemetery outside Newark, New Jersey, on a gray afternoon with the cold of coming winter in the air, Raphael stood in front of a headstone. Antonino Moro, 1941 to 1991. He stood for a while. Didn't say anything for most of it. Just stood the way you stand somewhere that used to hold someone you loved. One hand in his coat pocket, touching two pieces of paper without taking them out, the old one and the new one. The name he had carried for 30 years and the word he had received last week. Then, quietly, in Italian, because this was the kind of thing that only worked in the first language, he said, Papa, ho imparato come facevi. Dad, I learned how you did it. He turned and walked out of the cemetery. Newark spread out in front of him, gray, loud, fully indifferent to the moment that had just occurred inside its borders. The way cities always are, which is both their failure and their gift. He walked back toward his car. He had a meeting in Milan to prepare for. 2 months was not a long runway. He pulled out his phone and opened a message to Vera. He typed, Dates for Milan, March 14 through 16. Let me know if that works. He sent it. He put the phone back in his pocket. He kept walking. There are people we turn down not because we don't want them, but because we don't trust ourselves not to damage them with the life we're living. We call that protecting them. We rehearse it to ourselves in the private language of 3 in the morning, when we're being as honest as we ever get. And then life sits us down in a car for 45 minutes with that person. Puts us in a hotel bar on the 40th floor, gives us 9 pages of Japanese in a carry-on at midnight, and makes us sit with everything we were so certain we were doing for the right reasons. Raphael Moro spent 20 years making sure he controlled every room he walked into. The room that finally changed him was a small hotel workroom in Seoul, with a piece of old paper on the table between them and someone reading his father's name in the right accent for the first time in 30 years. He didn't get back what he had spent. That is not how it works. Nobody gets that back. What he got was smaller and more durable, clarity about what he had done, and the understanding of what he wanted to do differently, and an address in Milan, and a word for a type of mushroom that grows only under specific conditions, found mostly by people looking for something else. He was going to look it up when he got home. He was going to send the dates in the morning. He sent them that evening instead. If you stayed until the very last word, thank you, the real kind of thank you. This story asks a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. Not whether someone can change, because we already know that answer. The question is, what does it actually cost to change? What do you have to set down, or return, or stand in front of, and say, I did that, before you get to the other side of it? Raphael paid his price. In a hotel bar on the 40th floor of a building in Seoul. And then on a phone call that he didn't have to make but made, and then standing at a gravestone in Newark in the November cold, saying the only thing left to say. That's what it looks like when it's real. Not a big revelation. Not a dramatic moment. Just a man doing the next right thing, and then the next one after that, carrying what he carried, moving forward. Leave something in the comments. Have you ever protected someone by staying away from them? Did you find out later what that protection actually cost? I'm genuinely asking. I read them. If this story landed somewhere real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has been putting off a phone call. Someone who has been calling their avoidance by a better name. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of each other. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
Here's what this story is really about. It is not about a mafia boss in Seoul. It is not about a missing interpreter or a hidden document or a business deal worth $40 million. Those are just the container. What is inside the container is something much older and much more uncomfortable. This is a story about what we do when we are afraid and how we dress that fear up in language that sounds responsible. Rafael Moro told himself he was protecting Vera by saying no. 3 times, over 20 months, he chose distance and called it wisdom. He chose silence and called it discipline. He deleted a text message that asked him a direct question and called the deletion a decision. And in a very specific way, he was right. It was a decision. Every act of avoidance is a decision. The problem is that decisions have consequences, and the consequences do not stop arriving just because you stopped looking at them. The lesson here is not that you should say yes to everything you want. The lesson is that you should be honest with yourself about why you are saying no. There is a version of no that comes from genuine wisdom, from knowing your limits, from understanding your circumstances, from protecting what actually matters. And there is a version of no that comes from fear, wearing the coat of wisdom. Only you know which one is speaking when you make the call. Raphael learned the difference in a hotel bar in Seoul at 10 o'clock at night, when a woman said a name, 4 words, completely ordinary, and 37 years of friendship and 20 months of deliberate choice, suddenly connected in a way that could not be undone. That is how consequence works. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives, and then you are sitting with it, and there is nowhere else to go. The second lesson is this: the strongest person in any room is not the one who never needs anyone. The strongest person is the one who is honest enough to recognize when someone else understands something they do not, and humble enough to say so out loud. Raphael spent 20 years controlling every room he walked into. The room that changed him was the one where he finally admitted he could not read the language, where he finally trusted someone else to translate him correctly. That admission did not make him weaker. It made him, for the first time, fully present. And the last lesson belongs to all of us. Doing the right thing does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like standing at a grave in November, saying the only sentence that was left to say. But you say it anyway. Because integrity is not the thing you perform for an audience. It is the thing you do when the outcome is no longer in your hands and you do it anyway. That is the kind of strength this story is really about. Not power over others. Power over yourself in the moments when pretending would have been so much easier.